Hi, this is Paul. Today is, I feel like I'm Tim Pool or someone doing a daily sit down here with you for about an hour. Just sort of the way my schedule worked. I didn't have quite as many conversations this week. I've got a couple of randos tomorrow, guys who happily grab the rando slots. They go immediately when I open them up, and that's why the schedule always looks full. Because of this, I only open them up a week ahead of time. So that's why when you write me and say, "Oh, the rando slots are full," that's the rando slots are always full. They go within the first hour of me opening them up. So sorry about that. It's just a function of being me and only being one me. Now I spent a fair amount of this afternoon. So those of you who are care about how I organize the church life and the preaching schedule, I have been using a combination of the narrative lectionary, which comes out of the Lutheran tradition, and the revised common lectionary, and that's why some of you noted that I've been preaching the same text as your Roman Catholic Church and as some other churches. So I've been doing that, but after Pentecost, there's Trinity Sunday, and then it goes to Common Time, and that's when I usually head out on my own, and I'm going to be doing paying a little bit of attention to Paul of Tarsus and looking at some of the texts that outline his life. So that's what'll be coming up in the rough drafts in June. The worship guy at church, Pete. If you watch the church channel, you'll see Pete. Pete has been bugging me. I need the June texts. I need the June texts. Okay, so I got the June texts for Pete. Another big experiment that I've been doing has been using Substack to sort of archive and broaden out the tweets that I do on Twitter a little bit. Apparently Clubhouse has come to Android, so Vervaeke and Rafe, people have been raving about Clubhouse, and I wasn't about to buy an iPhone to get on Clubhouse, so we'll see if I play around with that. But for the most part, if you send me a message on Facebook, I'm probably not going to see it. I just can't stand Facebook. I have to keep it because we have to stream Facebook for the church, and there are a couple other reasons that I go there. I don't even check notifications. I just detest Facebook that much. Twitter, however, if you can sort of limit it, can be of some use, and I sort of enjoy Twitter. But Twitter is a temptation engine. It just you just can be snappy and snarky on Twitter so easily. But I have gotten into the habit. Some of you have figured out my schedule by now. Generally speaking, I release my videos at 6 a.m. on every day, at least Monday through Friday, if I have one to release, and that's most days. And then I usually sit down and either try and do a summary of my video or do another little writing summary. So that's often what I do in the morning. And just try and get my head together. If I'm going to organize a video, I'll try and get it together then, work on my sermon. So I usually spend the morning hours when I'm freshest trying to do my most creative work. And Peterson, we had this Peterson drought where he didn't produce anything, and we had sort of the decadent book tour where Peterson was just out there doing book tours, and every now and then there'd be a good video that would come along that I would treat. But Jordan's staying home and pumping out the videos, and now I see what it's like to be you, because he's putting out more than I can handle, and certainly more than I want to do a commentary on. And I had just finished the video that I posted today. Today is Tuesday, May 11, which was a combination of some commentary on Pageau and Boyce, and then Peterson and Randall Wallace. I really liked that conversation between Peterson and Randall Wallace. But I didn't think it deserved the full treatment in terms of a full commentary video. There was a lot of good stuff in there. And Peterson, if he's talking to the right conversation partner, either I'm understanding him more clearly, or in increasing clarity, he's able to articulate his basic stance on Christianity and religion. And it's a common comment from people. Some people in the comment section say, well, Peterson is the best Christian I know. And I think that's an interesting comment from a guy who makes his statements about his relationship with Christianity are ambiguous. Sometimes he'll say he is, sometimes he'll say he isn't. He doesn't go to church. He readily admits that. So, okay. Peterson is also the guy who kind of riffs on Nietzsche, saying, well, Jesus was the only Christian. Okay. So the whole definition of Christianity is a huge topic, and I've been tempted to make a video or two on that, but my videos really they just depend on what I'm thinking about as I'm thinking about them, or if I'm having a conversation, or however they fly. And I had no sooner sort of settled that video, and then there was just a bombardment of messages coming to me about this conversation that he had with Roland Griffiths, who I'd never heard of. And so yesterday afternoon and evening, I moved my way through that video. And Peterson's videos are now, they're getting long. And so, I spent, 5 hours making my Peterson barren commentary? And I'm glad I did. But I don't always have that kind of time to give to stuff. And there was a lot of interesting stuff in the psychedelic video. And so I decided that I would try using Twitter and then Substack for that. And I often get the question about psychedelics, and I have the sense that psychedelics the question of psychedelics is an area that polarizes very quickly. And so I often get the sense that I don't fully satisfy both tribes with my answer. But if you want to know my answer about psychedelics and Christianity, I wrote a Substack about it. It's fairly brief, and there it is. If you've taken psychedelics, I'm not going to ostracize you or condemn you. Do I recommend them? No. Do I recommend that Christians necessarily investigate them? No. But again, if you do, and I have many friends that have, I'm not going to hate you or look down on you for doing it. I think it's kind of dangerous. I think skydiving is dangerous, yet friends of mine do it. I'm not going to jump out of an airplane with a parachute. It's just not what appeals to me. And Sylvan Bear made a comment on my videos that, it's too bad Paul wasn't in the study. I actually saw the sign up for the study when it went out. Probably one of you sent it to me. And I asked myself, would I do a study like that? And the answer was no, I won't. And in that way, Pageau followed up on Twitter with my tweet. And then someone... To me, I don't need a chemical to experience the glory of God, the sorrow of God, the forgiveness of God, at least these things from God. I don't personally see the need. Again, I'm not judging or condemning those of you who mess with this stuff. I don't drink alcohol. I don't smoke tobacco. I do drink soda with caffeine, so I'm not a Mormon, but just not my thing. So if you want to know what I think about psychedelics, head to the Substack. And I'm liking the Substack as a platform. It's ad-free, which is glorious, unlike so much of the web is just unreadable unless you've got a reading mode in a browser. But all my Substacks are free at this point. I might decide to monetize at some point in the future, and if I do, it'll just probably monetize the archives or something like that. But at this point, it's just all free. And if you want to get it right off the press, you can just find me on Twitter. Tweets are free, and my tweets are free. And so I'm enjoying using Substack, and I'm finding it a good platform for doing a little bit of writing. At some point, I know I'm going to have to do some more serious writing. I'm really ADHD, and that makes writing longer, harder things in my future really difficult. I'm going to need to structure up for it and find a. One of the things that I know about myself is I'm a person that really loves routine, and I've told this story before. All through elementary school, I had a tuna fish sandwich for lunch. I had scrambled eggs for breakfast. Dinner, whatever mom put on the table was fine with me. People ask me my favorite food. It's usually the food that's sitting in front of me. My mother would say, "Don't you want something besides a tuna fish sandwich for lunch?" I'd say, "No. Why change? I like it." I'm a very rut person. And so if I'm going to accomplish anything, I need to find a way for it to fit into my routine and allow my routine to evolve around it. I need to see reason for it. And so Substack's working for that. And Christianity and universal religion. Now, what I really want to do, though, is, and I don't know that I'll have enough time right now to do it in one sitting, and I don't have a video ready to go for tomorrow, so I'm going to release this on Wednesday morning, no matter what I do with this video. But this conversation between Richard Rohlin and Jonathan Pageau on universal history really grabbed me. Why? Well, why did I even start talking about the psychedelic business? The goal of Christianity is the unification of heaven and earth. The Bible begins with a rupture, and it ends with a reconciliation. That's one way to understand Christianity. It's the reconciliation of heaven and earth. Now, and you can see this, in Mathieu Pageau's work. That's right. That's the goal of Christianity, the reconciliation of heaven and earth. Now, there are lots of different ways to articulate that. Union with Christ, being with God. But it's what separates Christianity from Gnosticism is the flesh gets redeemed too. In a lesson, I think I even videoed it. You can find it somewhere in the church channel, perhaps. It was in one of my Sunday school classes. It was basically about the redemption of squirrels, because you can note some of the beneath the surface Gnosticism in certain forms, in certain evangelicals, when all that gets saved are souls. We have to save souls. We have to save souls. Well, sure, our souls need saving, but our bodies need redeeming. Christianity is about resurrection. And my take on the mission of God is that God will not be satisfied until the rebellion is both overcome and accomplished. And what that means is that whereas there's lots of traditions that have, and I talk a little bit about universal religion in this Substack, there's a lot of traditions that imagine an afterlife, and Christianity also imagines and asserts an afterlife. But in Christianity, there's a little bit of debate, the intermediate state, because it's in anticipation of resurrection. Resurrection isn't just a miracle that happened, like Jesus stilled the storm, multiplied loaves and fishes, turned water to wine, walked out of the grave. No, the resurrection is a categorical shift. It's the inflection point of history. Now, how does that impact my take on psychedelics? I really liked the conversation that Peterson had. Peterson is getting better, and he's more like himself, and he's more fun to watch again, which is awesome to see. because the dude is just fun to watch. I mean, that's why, when I first discovered Peterson, like many of you, okay, the biblical lectures had started, but I had to wait week after week. And so what did I feed on? I fed on his class lectures. It's just fun to watch, fun to listen to him riff, fun to watch him get into fights, although he didn't like it, but it was fun. So, he was fun in this conversation again, and that's good. And he's been more fun in a bunch of the other conversations, more relaxed. I think it's a good decision of his not to talk to reporters. Even though he gets punchy and snarky, and that can be fun too. The much more relaxed Peterson is talking to someone that he has a degree of confidence in that the thing isn't going to go south. And they're not going to attack him. But yet, he needs someone who's going to, challenge him a little bit. So, and Rohlin Griffith seemed to be, a super nice guy. And so it was a fun conversation. And they obviously both respected each other. And it was good. As at one point in the conversation, Peterson makes a comment. See, now I'm starting, and now it's like, well, maybe I should pull up the video and do it. And the Bridges of Meaning guys made memes about exactly what's going through my ADHD addled head right now. I've never had Ritalin or Adderall or anything like that. I'm just at the mercy of my learning disability. But Peterson makes this comment about psychedelics and materialism. And it's a fair comment that in some ways psychedelics are a validation of materialism, and that, oh, look, you can induce a religious experience. You can reliably induce a religious experience with a chemical. To me, that doesn't change anything because we are a living nefesh. We are, and again, I think Mathieu Pageau really nails it there. We are the combination of heaven and earth. We are the inflection point. And that's a really key thing. But, so then what actually do these chemicals do? And they had, again, a lot of interesting conversation. But I walk away from this conversation for the same reason I walk away from, let's imagine instead of a chemical you put in your brain, you can put on a headset and have the greatest computer game imaginable, and you can live your whole life in that headset playing a computer game all in your head. The reason we don't respect that is because we are ourselves the union of heaven and earth. We are the stuff of earth and the breath of God. Now, that is true symbolically. That is true. I think that is a deeply true thing. And it's true of us phenomenologically. It's true of us physically. And in that way, psychedelics, I think, give testimony to that. And that was part of where Peterson kept pushing Griffiths. And Griffiths is not used to playing this game, but this is a game Peterson loves to play. So that's where, that was part of what was fun because, well, what about DMT and demons? What is real? So, those questions linger. And as a Christian, I tend to have a sober take on it and say, if God told Israel not to play with the mediums, I'm not going to go looking to pick fights that don't come to me. So, but my point in all of this, which is going to connect up to the Universal History video, is, well, I wanted to say one other thing. So Andrew had this video on a conversation with Tammy Peterson and Tim from the Discord server who I met in Australia. I look forward to meeting. I'm going to do a conference here. I'm going to do a conference at some point just because I want to have you all together. When I got married, I wasn't in any way anticipating or looking forward to the wedding. I was looking forward to what came after the wedding. But when the wedding happened, okay, the wedding was sort of like a church service. My father preached, my pastor preached. But then after the wedding was the reception. And the reception was fun because I had all my friends together in one place and we ate and drank. And it was terrific. We didn't dance because we're Dutch Calvinists. And if you want to see how Dutchmen dance, you can go to Holland, Michigan this time of year. It ain't pretty. But I'm so distracted. I'm so ADHD. I should probably drink caffeine. It'd probably settle me down like Ritalin because it's a stimulant. Anyway, where was I going with this? Okay. Tammy Peterson was on this video, and she talked about practice. Now, I could do a whole video on that whole conversation on a lot of different levels. But the point is, the dude strapped into a VR helmet, the person who is shooting up any chemical in them, any mood-altering chemical in them, is doing something. But they're not necessarily accomplishing what we were made to accomplish. And at a deep level, we all know it. Let's say if I am ill and my doctor gives me an antibiotic or a Tylenol or something like that, the point of that drug is to restore me to health, to restore me living and moving and acting in this world. That's why artists are such interesting people, because, Jonathan Pageau, he's taking the mental and he's putting it into the physical. So if the goal of Christianity is the unification of heaven and earth, reunification of heaven and earth, it's the reconciliation of all things. The New Testament talks about this in many different ways. How is this to be accomplished? Well, if you've been listening to my last video, story is integral in our appropriation of these things. And the unification of story is integral in our ability to form productive and meaningful and satisfying communities. It's part of the reason churches work. It's part of the reason churches fracture, because stories fracture. It's part of the reason nations fracture. And now stories, people will look at economics, they'll look at all sorts of factors, but story is really what binds us together, because in terms of the nexus point between heaven and earth, story is right in there. And Peterson's work on that is integral. Now, to the degree that a psychedelic helps change a person's story, well, then it will be productive. And if it helps change a person's story in a positive direction, well, then it will be productive. But that story has to be manifest in all of the ways that we ripple out into the world. Now, the past is always with us through story. Not just through story, through physical artifacts and all of these things, but through story. And, a big part of the thinking that I've been doing lately has been, I started out noticing Peterson, and it's like, what's going on with Pete? What's going on with that guy? What is happening? And in the, I really like the Griffith video where they're both wrestling with that. And, but, Jonathan Pageau, what's going on with him? And, I have to, I'm just going to speak my mind like I always do. I'm a little bit more careful talking about Jonathan because, unlike Peterson, I've got more of a relationship with Jonathan. Not much. If I do a conference, Pageau and Vervaeke, that was the conference that was going to happen in Thunder Bay. I don't know the future or the possibility. It was canceled for 2021 too, just because of COVID. But I look forward to sitting together with Pageau and Vervaeke, and I don't know if that'll happen on the same stage at the same time, but once I can get a chance to travel around and probably arrange, if Pageau's coming to the West Coast, Jonathan, save a couple days. We'll do a conference here. It'll be a small one because I only have a small facility, but we can do a conference of 100 people here, and might cost a little bit of money. for the attendees, because I'm going to have to pay Jonathan's cost and give him an honorarium, and I'm going to make sure that Living Stones, because I have to make sure that I'm the pastor here. I don't own the building. The church owns the building. The church is going to need something from the conference for its own continued operation. But that's what I want to do. And it's fun talking with people over the Discord server, but to meet them face to face, to embrace them, take those masks off, to smell their breath, to touch their hands, to embrace them, to sit down and eat with them. And what do we do when we sit and eat? We tell stories. We rehearse the stories of maybe things that we talked on the Discord server or things that we talked on a video. And we get our story straight that way, and the story begins to emerge. Now, let's start playing the video, because if I don't start playing, I'll just keep talking and I'll never even get around to it. As it is now, I'm sure I can't get through the whole thing right now. Here we go.
Couple of articles for Symbolic World. I have a couple more that are in the pipe, but I just keep not, finishing them. But I've written some things there specifically on hagiography, which is a subject that's really important to me.
And when I heard that, I thought, that is a really interesting topic. So come June, I'm going to be, I thought about doing an epistle, because I looked over everything that I've preached for the last 7-8 years, and it's so heavy on narrative, just because I love narrative so much. And I started in Genesis about 8 years ago, and I've been going through, and I never really gave the epistles enough focus. And that's really unusual for a Dutch Calvinist and a Protestant pastor, because Protestants tend to focus on the epistles more than just about anything else. And I usually haven't, just because I love narrative so much. But so I'm trying to get a handle. Well, how can I, because I want to give my congregation a sense of the importance of the Apostle Paul. How do I go about that? Then you start reading the book of Acts. And one of the things that comes through in the book of Acts is that Luke is a fan. Luke is a fan of Paul. And I've been reading a little bit more church fathers lately and early church history, Eusebius. And, our modern method is to dismiss hagiography. Just take it off the table. But when it comes to someone like the Apostle Paul, there's so little information. You can get bits and pieces from his letters. You take that with Luke's, fan work from the book of Acts, and you have to put it together. And anyone who's taken a close look at these texts knows that, just like with gospel issues, if you're focusing in a modernistic way to put down a physical history, you got to do a little bit of work to try and get the whole thing to match up. And so hagiography is often just simply dismissed. But, I think about the Critical Drinker and canon. I haven't done a video on that one yet. Maybe I should. But the whole question of canon today, with respect to things like Star Wars or Star Trek, well, in Star Wars especially, fan fiction became a really important part. And, well, what is the real Star Wars? How does fan fiction fit in there? So these are kind of important questions. There's so much in this video. I'm not going to get anywhere. He just said one word and I went off on it.
As it's actually the main genre of literature in the Middle Ages. Like, far and away, there's more hagiography than literally anything else.
Now, that's really important. You say, well, why is that important? That sounds like a terrible thing. Well, because they weren't writing modernist history in the Middle Ages, because modernity hadn't happened yet. And what does that tell us about the Middle Ages? And what does that tell us about history? And what does that tell us about how we think about history? Well, first of all, who was motivated to write about someone but a fan, someone who thought they were important? And so, is my whole channel hagiography about Jordan Peterson? It's insufficiently hagiographic for some of you. I know that. You let me know that. And that's absolutely fine. And it's too hagiographic for others of you. And a lot of them don't stay with the channel because it's just too hagiographic for them. What do I mean by that? It's not, I mean, because you come to the channel to be either validated in your love or hatred of Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Pageau or John Van Donk. There's not a lot of John Van Donk fans out there, but maybe there's one. I don't think his wife has watched a single one of my videos. Would she be his fan? I don't know. Usually wives are too smart to be a fan. It's like, I know too much about you to be your fan. Certainly my wife doesn't watch my videos, and I know too much about you to be your fan. So, but that comment alone tells you something. And, so part of my interest in Tom Holland is here's someone who is, again, Peterson and Holland are evolving out of modernity, and it's just happening to them. And they're talking about it, and they're exploring, and they're open, and they're honest. That makes them tremendously fun to watch. But that means that, we're going to have to, if you're a medieval historian, you have to deal with hagiography. And modernism is just sort of dismissive of it. Because modernism says, well, what I care is the physical history. Nah, you don't really. Because that's just boring. You want to get inside of the characters and see the world through their eyes. And so in that sense, hagiography is important. All right, more.
And but it's not, not a lot of attention is paid to it.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, I'm a philologist. Basically, that means I study old words and old texts and old stories and the languages that they're all written in. And I'm a data scientist, which, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of a modern day soothsayer. And so, but
think about that. He's a data scientist, a modern day soothsayer. Well, why? Well, I don't know. You read Yuval Harari. What does he say? He says, well, the computers are going to be the gods of our future religion. It's all going to be about data, because in the past we used this meaty intuition to watch our signals. Now, in the future, we're going to go to Google and say, well, okay, Google, tell us what we really think. Well, what are you if Google knows you better than you know yourself? Think about that.
My main deal is kind of looking at medieval stories. Two things. One is looking at medieval stories and seeing meaning there. And then
Now, children often, a succeeding generation has biases about the previous generation. Children react to their parents. It's the grandchildren that come along who weren't raised by their parents that often adore their grandparents in a way they don't adore their parents. And so there's this sort of tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock way through history. And modernity, of course, left medieval things behind. Oh, we're getting beyond that. We're going to be objective. We're going to see the world as it is. We're going to wield the monarchical vision and finally make materiality our master, make earth our master. We're going to ascend into the throne of God and make earth our master, and it's going to be our slave. That's what modernity did. And what's so funny is that they read the Bible, and later on they said, oh, you Christians made physicality your slave. It's like, well, Christians certainly were involved all along the way, but I think you're kind of reading that into Genesis. Anyway, so as this is, again, another sign that we're getting beyond modernity, because now there's a fresh appreciation for the Middle Ages. Well, what were the Middle Ages?
The other one is sort of, I have now developed a kind of sideline in reminding other academics that the Middle Ages was a Christian period, which you would think people would know this, but I mean, I once had a conversation with a fairly well-known medievalist about the Holy Grail. And I was talking to this person and, making an argument for kind of a liturgical reading of Chrétien's Grail story, which one of these days we're going to do a video on. And And, he said to me something like, well, aren't you reading a lot into that? I said, well, I mean, there is a host in it. And he looked at me, no lie, looked at me and said, what's a host? So, my
Ouch!
basic sideline, and I'm kind of in connection with this. I was going through a recent translation of the Pearl poem, which I write about in Amid Weeping There Is Joy, which is a book that we had that just came out. We'll talk about that later. But I was reading a recent translation of the Pearl poem, and the scholar, who again is a very well-known medievalist, she translated the word mass as feast, just sort of like generically feast. So like completely took the mass out of the poem.
Amazing.
Which the poem is all about the mass. So,
and they say the medieval period is the Dark Ages. And again, I've said this before. It may very well be that 100 years from now, the Dark Ages will be 1500 to 2000 roughly, instead of 500 to 1500.
Things like that. So basically, my new thing is just reminding people of the Middle Ages was a Christian period, and that there was a sort of a narrative and a ritual context for all of that, and that should actually affect the way we read these stories.
Exactly. And I think that what we want to do now is...
And this, again, is part of the reason I think Tom Holland is sort of at a forefront, because if you listen to Tom's telling of part of what has provoked the transformations in Tom Holland as they are, a lot of it is because he's honest and competent and said, I should read these in a certain way. And once he got into them, he kind of wanted to be in them, but how? And that's where he's struggling through what he's struggling through.
Part of helping people understand, one of the things that the Middle Ages act as a kind of mythological substructure to the modern world, whether people want to or not. Even though people are trying to kind of move away from it, so much of our dark, like even the idea that it's kind of went into the dark place where we have these dark stories and these fairy tales and these strange misunderstood stories, because the fairy tale, even if it's not medieval, it's medieval in its structure and it's medieval in its illusions, let's say.
Right.
And so all of that shows us that the Middle Ages are acting as this kind of, just like for the Greeks of the times of Athens, the Trojan War and the Odyssey were like this mythological backdrop to who they were. The Middle Ages are the mythological backdrop to who we are. And so we need to diving back into it and having a clear vision of what it can tell us and how it can more consciously structure our reality can be one of the solutions to the disenchantment that we're facing.
And that's a huge point that he just made there. And it's not just that the Middle Ages are this substructure, but I'm going to get to a point in a minute. But again, back to Lewis and the discarded image. The Middle Ages were a digestion of the classical world. And so what you have there then is a lineage of meaningful mythology. Now, again, and I guess this is where my conversation with these two gets interesting, because, it's easy to sit and lament about modernity and the Protestant Reformation, but it happened for a reason. And it wasn't just that Luther was a bad egg. The Protestant Reformation was bubbling up for hundreds of years before the Luther breakout and the Swiss breakout. Jan Hus, it happened. And so it was going to happen. It had to happen. And I would assert it was a vital element of the long-term process towards the unification of heaven and earth. Well, why? Well, modernity is another level of struggle in that story. And I well, so what role is Jonathan Pageau playing in this? Well, who knows? 100 years from now, I don't know that anyone I make a video about today will be remembered. That's just the way history goes. We don't have the perspective to know how important or unimportant the work that we're doing right now is to the future. We don't know. But what is Pageau doing? Pageau is, in a sense, in the medieval period, they had to sum up and take account of the classical period. And that took, 1,000 years. Now, at the end of modernity, we're just beginning to gain a little bit of perspective to figure out how we can continue the process of integration. And that's where the question of consciousness comes in. Because, well, again, most of medieval literature is hagiographic. What is hagiography? Well, the consciousness of the author is fully integrated into the stories of the text. Now, as a modernist, because again, this was what we discovered. We took out one eye, and this is how we discovered, we can see the world differently like this, and we can do stuff if we take away all of this agency and all of God, and we'll just follow one little aspect of the world, and we will have knowledge if we do this. And this idea, which started in the lab, got loose. I don't know where would I find an illustration of something that someone was playing with in a lab get loose and the whole world changed and basically had to stay at home for a year? I don't know where I could get such an illustration. You tell me. Anyway, so that gets out of the lab. And once it gets out of the lab, we look at hagiography and say, it's so contaminated with two-eyedness. Is that contamination? And now we're into postmodernity. Isn't everything that slips out of your mouth or that you make with your hands contaminated with your two-eyedness? It's only in the land of the blind that the one-eyed man is king. Those of us who have two eyes, watching the one-eyed man stumble and walk into doors because he can't sense depth perception. He can't evaluate a whole bunch of other things. So what we're doing now is Pageau is sort of, trying to pull your hand off a little bit and say, why did you try? Just, no. Yeah, look a little bit. Oh, they're going to meme that to death. That's what he's doing. And now he's got helpers. And that's really cool.
It's funny because somebody asked a question, and this might have been on an episode. I think this is on an episode of the Emmons Fool podcast. Somebody wrote in with a question of basically like, well, why is all fantasy or like the vast majority of fantasy, why is it set in a medieval setting? And it's for exactly the reason you just described. And this is
because we remember when we had both eyes.
What I was trying to explain. It's that's where we look back to, right? That's where our meaning comes from. Even that's where our monsters come from that we're dealing with right now. Like it's all sort of contained in there because there's this big medieval synthesis where basically it's the only time in human history when we've really had everything sort of come together and mesh together and fit together.
That's amazing because you say that and so many people who are listening will think, what? The Dark Ages had a synthesis where everything came together?
No, they saw with both eyes. And so again, I watched Vikings and I really liked it because Vikings tried to see through two eyes in a lot of different levels. And I've been watching The Last Kingdom, and every time one of those characters sounds like a cynical 21st century millennial, I want to throw something at the TV. Because it's like all this dismissive, I just listen and I just think no one in that year would ever say anything like that.
And it just shows how ignorant we are of what the Middle Ages had.
Well, and that's really, we're going to be talking about universal history today. That's really what universal history is about. It's about showing how the Christianity of the Middle Ages. Chesterton, in his poem "The Battle of the White Horse," he said, "It's only Christian men who, It's only Christian men who protect even pagan things."
Mm.
In other words, only Christianity, has the, let's say, the Catholicity, the universality, right, to actually take in the entire pagan world and integrate it, find a place for everything. And that's what you see basically happening in universal history. It's a way
That's a huge point.
of fitting our story, right, the story of my people, whoever my people are, into kind of a master story, a master narrative.
Yeah. And this is something which was already there, let's say, before Christianity. That is, we have to understand that the ancient pagans had an intuition about other peoples, which is that
Just read the book of Genesis. That's what the book of Genesis is doing.
when they would encounter other peoples, they would always be trying to pinpoint, for example, like, okay, so they have these strange gods. Let's recognize the strange gods, right? So, okay, so when they talk about this god, they're referring to Zeus, or they're referring to Ares, or they're referring to the same gods we have. They just had different names, and some of them, and it wasn't like a perfect system. Sometimes it was like, well, their god seems to be like a joining of these two gods that we're worshiping, let's say. But there was a sense in which it's not like this strange modern idea that somehow things are so arbitrary that they just pop up and you people can have all these traditions that are arbitrary, but rather that there is a common human experience, whether we're connected historically or just in terms of our nature, that will bring about similar stories, that will bring about similar principalities, that will notice different principalities in the world, and we end up worshiping the same gods. And so
this is why I call Pageau the apostle of purpose. Why? Because if you want to boil it all down, this should put on his tombstone, it's not arbitrary. I mean, that's the point he's making again and again and again. And now what I'm about to say is don't throw anything at your TV, okay? It's not worth it. Don't throw your phone across the room. Don't smash your computer. I know how reactive some of you are. When you look at all the woke sexuality, that's a part of this. And I don't mean that in a negative, dismissive sense. It's an attempt to appropriate something. It's a struggle to, again, it's a struggle to figure out heaven and earth. Earth is the body. Heaven is this self that that doesn't decay like the body does. It doesn't change like the body does. Okay. And so when you look at, I really liked what Jordan Peterson had to say to Brett Weinstein about this. And, he's talking about his toddler granddaughter who's Pocahontas. Well, she's trying on things. Okay. This is, and we do this as young children. This is heaven meets earth, but we keep doing this. And this is where the universal history begins to take shape and fit in.
Even it was there before Christianity, but then when Christianity arrived, there is almost this idea that all of this now culminates into Christ, and all the good elements of these ancient traditions can be kind of pulled into this one story.
Yeah. In The Discarded Image, Lewis says, I think it's in the preface or like the introduction to the book, he says that there was, of course, and he actually divides it into right and left. Obviously, you'll understand, and your listeners who've been paying attention for a long time will understand the symbolism of the left hand really is to sort of push something away, right? So he says there's a Christian left that was always trying to get rid of these things.
Yeah.
But then there was always a Christian right who would say, along with, St. Justin Martyr or Justin the Philosopher, whatever true things have been said by men at any time belong to us Christians.
And this gets into, often when I talk about the antithesis, which is the antithetical, right, wrong, push things away. So that's left hand, I guess. I'm dyslexic. I never know what hand I'm using. So that's left hand. But then the other, which is the Christian claiming. And so you have this in someone like Abram Kuyper, for whom you have the antithesis still, but you all also have there's not one square inch that Christ doesn't claim this is mine. And so this left hand and right hand continues on through.
Of course, you could look at that now and say, oh, that's just appropriationism or something like that. And first of all, technically, yes, right? There is, this university in California that has this proposed, class that they want to start teaching that actually Christianity is guilty of what they call theocide, which again, yes, sort of our
it's always in California, isn't it?
Deal, right? But also, what people don't always understand there is that when these things die, that they have a capacity to be resurrected in a way that allows them to participate within the larger story of the Christian world. So you do see the seeds of this happening in, for instance, Herodotus, when he encounters Egyptian society, spends a whole lot of time trying to figure out how do the gods that the Egyptians worship map to the gods that we worship, right? But then what Christianity does is it integrates it in a more complete way, right?
And you can buy an English language version of Herodotus, translated by Tom Holland, at all the best book shops.
So that you don't have competing principalities, so that everything is able to kind of lay itself out in a hierarchy that lets you figure out where your story fits into this larger narrative. Yeah,
exactly. And the idea of that we're appropriating, it's so hilarious. It's as if it's like you think that that these were copyrights, or that the purpose of the world is to be original and to like come up with the new thing that hasn't been done before. Every time someone says that Christianity has elements of things that are there before them, I'm thinking, like, are you patenting these things? Like, what reality do you actually live in? Like, that's how it works. We take the things that are given to us, and then we try to fit them in a way that will be more real, and that will be more conducive to like a universal history, like the one that Christianity finally ended up coming towards. That this was actually a historical process that wasn't done by one person, that was kind of, we don't even know who was doing it sometimes. It just is this organic thing that happens and pops up in legends and pops up in different texts. But it's just a funny thing, like to think that somehow these stories, that that somehow reality is so arbitrary that we could
the apostle of reason. I'm sorry, the apostle of purpose.
That we could be like stealing ideas from other, like companies steal tech ideas from each other.
Yeah. One way to think about the development of narrative in the Middle Ages is that it's not until a very, very late stage, basically until Dante, right? Dante is kind of the first self-conscious author, right? In the sense that he's really the first person. Obviously there are a lot of works which will begin with, pray for the poor wretched sinner whose name I'm not even going to give you because I'm so unworthy, because I'm going to now relate to you these great things, or something like that. But Dante's really the first sort of like, in one sense, kind of, he's standing right there on the cusp of the medieval and the modern, because he's the first person who sort of writes himself into the story.
And this is my point, that you might say, oh, I wish the Protestant Reformation had never happened. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And you might say at this point, I wish modernity would stay forever and me and Steven Pinker can overlook our graves, pondering the nothingness will soon be, and drink a toast to all of this reason and things. Well, okay. But it's going away. We're not really the author of this grand story. We have our little parts we play.
But before that, the writing in the Middle Ages is characterized by two things. One is a deep respect for authority. And authority really, at the end of the day, means anything else written down, right? Because writing is very expensive. People don't write stuff unless it's important.
Okay, and back when I was doing the Philip Carey, using that, those are the early days of my videos, you have the turn to the text, he calls it. And that's what he's talking about. It's this deep respect of authority. It is written. And you have this in, scripture. It is written. It is written. Now, of course, the printing press, well, before the printing press, all writing was, it was poured, attention was poured. Every book that was written was written. Then suddenly the machine comes and books are cheap in many ways.
So a deep respect for the authority of the earlier text. And then
and now I think we have to think psychologically here, and I'm not a psychologist, but I comment on one on TV, at least if you're watching me on your TV. And, Plato wrote about this. There's something about the written word where we take this living thing which comes out of our mouth, and now I'm doing it on YouTube, and it's recorded, and it's played back with video and all of that. But we take this thing and we put it on the page, and you can see, bits of that in cultures that aren't necessarily, that don't have writing. And then the magic of this thing on the page that comes out to them. It makes me think of a guy who used to go to this church who was illiterate. He was illiterate because he was part of the Dust Bowl migration from the Midwest to California, and he got polio when he was a child, so he wasn't allowed to go to school. He lived his whole life illiterate, and he came to church here with his brother who had Down syndrome. He was in his 70s, his brother was in his 50s, and and their mother, they lived with their mother, and their mother died, and stories.
Also, secondly, basically no concept of the idea of authorship. Like our ideas today of authorship, plagiarism, things like this would not even make sense back then. That's why
now, and you can read in Fatal Discord, that book that I paid a lot of attention to a couple of years ago, which was basically about Luther and Erasmus. You see it was just the early days. It was the wild west of the printed, printers would get a hold of a text, and I'm going to print this up and I'm going to send it out. And that's, basically what they did. And then printers would be, so you've got Luther, with all of his Luther angst and, volume, just spewing out stuff. And the printer's like, give it to me. I'll print it. And then I'll sell it. And Luther didn't get royalties. I mean, none of that system existed. That's all modern.
When people get a little hung up on things like, well, who's the real author of this pseudo-epigraphal text? Like, only a modern person can ask that question and it be meaningful, right? So I wrote an article on the symbolism of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, right? And his story basically just takes all of everything I'm saying right now and just kind of combined it, right? So there's this whole body of text, and the question is, most scholars today say it was actually authored by somebody that they're going to call pseudo Dionysius, So in other words, not Dionysius, but somebody else writing under his name, right? Well,
now this is fun. This is me and me and me. Listening to that, was thinking about, okay, well, what about this thing about authorship? Well, yesterday, in yesterday's videos, when I'm talking about Jorge Luis Borges, the Borgesian conundrum, well, what is that? Well, am I the author, or are these other things speaking through me? Are they rising through me? And so, if you think about that inattention to authorship, well, I'm going to get myself confused here. If you think about that inattention to authorship, well, it makes sense, but it's also sort of in a Barfieldian way. If you sort of go into that mode and think, well, why didn't they sort of grab onto a text like intellectual property like we have now? Well, it's because you can't grab onto that thing. And of course, I'm not in a place to evaluate the claim, but the claim is always that, well, the Native Americans didn't own land like we do. And it's like, well, they certainly understood possession of land and control of land and hunting rights and farming rights, yada, yada, yada. But then you think about this relationship between our self and stuff, and now we're going to get into politics and economics. Private property. Don't throw anything at your TV. It's not worth it. You can just turn me off or cuss at me or something like that. But you just think about how pseudepigraphal works act. And now, again, I always thought about it like, well, if you want someone to read it, I'm going to rename my channel Jordan B. Peterson. I'll get lots more hits until I get all those thumbs down when people get here. Like, you're not Jordan Peterson. But the whole concept of the individual, what and who we are, see, we often just look back and think, well, they were just like us. Well, they were kind of like us, but in other ways they weren't like this. These deep assumptions that are deeply cultural. And again, this is why, even though it's harder and harder to go around the world now and find someone that isn't at least conversant somehow in your culture, this deep programming differs tremendously. And this little tell about ownership of texts and writing as someone else. But again, we do play with these ideas, don't we? I mean, what is acting? I mean, is that who is on the screen? And I'm not just saying, oh, the old is better. I'm not saying that, but also shouldn't practice chronological snobbery the other way. Say, oh, the new is better. No, this is tough. But again, I love this video because it's just like point after point after point. He's like, ooh, bang, 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 bang. Lights are coming on.
That's essentially just a modern hang-up.
Yeah. And also it's also because it's the idea that text exists in a vacuum. Because the person who wrote that, pseudo Dionysius or whatever, who knows who wrote it, didn't write it out of his own mind. He didn't just sit down and think up something new to write. He was writing it based on things that had been handed down to him. And even if we don't know exactly how these things were handed down, they reveal themselves as being as they're received by the church and integrated into the church as appropriately transmitting certain things which were already there in the tradition.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So let's go into the history. So when we talk about universal history, the biggest thing that happens is the joining of the Hellenistic tradition and the Christian or the Jewish history or the Hebrew history. That seems to be like the biggest thing that happens. And it happens in Troy, in Alexander, and then ultimately joining all of this together with like the genealogies of scripture and how these different groups relate to each other. It's a bit about what that looks like, let's say.
So, and this is where, when I'm by no means an expert in anything, frankly, except being me. But you bump into these things. I remember when Pageau was talking about Alexander, and then you just notice that Troy comes up, and you think, well, yeah, that's because of Homer, and well, why is Homer so foundational? See, and then in a way, you really want Jordan Peterson to run in, because in some ways, okay, why Peterson, Pageau, and Holland? Well, they're all sort of dealing with this frontier, but in their different ways. And so Peterson would look at, well, why does Troy have more grip on our imagination than Gilgamesh? Or than other ancient texts? And of course, in an attempt for modernity to sort of not recede ground too easily to postmodernity, the move is, well, we're going to look at our evolutionary biology, and we'll get around you. You're saying that we're just motivated, seeing through two eyes, doing all these things. Well, evolutionary biology is how we'll sort of get underneath you and cut you off at the pass. And then the postmodern says, but you're doing your evolutionary biology through your two eyes again. You can't escape the dynamic that I've shown you. And of course, the easiest way is to just hold up a mirror and say, yeah, neither can you. We're stuck with this dynamic. So maybe we shouldn't fight it. Maybe we should be honest about it and continue to proceed onward, giving modernity its due. So Peterson will take a look at it through evolutionary psychology, and pattern. Pageau will look at all the patterns, and Holland will dig deep into history. And now we have another historian and a philologist. Now, of course, these academicians say, well, I'm not a historian, I'm a philologist. And yeah, fair enough. But you still know more history than I do, and you're spending more time with the text than I do. That's why I listen to you. That's why I can learn from you. But
I think kind of the first moment where this happens is actually probably in the book of Daniel. So in the book of Daniel, you have these prophecies, and of course, whether or not you think they're prophecies will depend on whether or not you believe such a thing as prophecy is possible. Can people write about events before they happen? But in the book of Daniel, you have these prophecies, some of which concern Alexander the Great. And so there's this legend that goes back into the time of antiquity, that Alexander the Great shows up to Jerusalem with an army, and the people of Jerusalem come out, and they they're please spare us, don't destroy the city, etc., etc. And so they bring out the high priest brings out the book of Daniel, and he reads to Alexander the prophecy concerning the rise of the Macedonian Empire in the book of Daniel. And Alexander is so profoundly impacted by this that he spares the city. So this is...
I had never heard that story before. And like you just said, it's a legend. I mean, you're not going to be able to physically nail this down. In fact, you might be able to disprove it physically in terms of timing and everything, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But how does that story function? The book of Daniel is such an interesting book, and the book of Daniel has such interesting controversy around it in a modernist age. And of course, it's a prophetic book for Christians in their Bible. It's a book of writings for Jews in their Bible in terms of the categorization. Chapters 1 through 6, these fascinating ordeals, trials between the God of the Hebrews and the gods of the pagan world. And at each time, of course, the God of the Hebrews is dunking on the pagan God, but hey, you're still a captive, you're still a slave. And so right away, these tensions that, you can find in the book of Ezekiel, let's say, these tensions are just all through the book. And then, of course, beginning in chapter 7, so in the first 6, I actually have, on this channel, it's on the church channel, one of my early videos before the Jordan Peterson videos, I was playing around with the book of Daniel and with YouTube. The book of Daniel is so interesting because chapter 7, there's this transition, and Daniel, who is like, Jewish captive Superman of sorts, because, there's always this trial, and he always comes up on top, and he's always given half the kingdom. And then back when the next story starts, he must have said something that the king didn't like, so he's, back on the B team, back on the practice squad, and he'll be elevated again. And so back and forth this happens. Chapter 7 you hit, and he's laying in bed, and he's just tormented. He's just, why would he be tormented and out of sorts? Well, because the what he knows to be true of heaven is not being manifest on earth. The God of gods and the King of kings that he uses, that it keeps dunking on the pagan gods, but the temple is destroyed and his people are in bondage. And when, Lord, when are you going to set the world right? In some ways, it's not that different from the Muslims that look at, American troops in Saudi Arabia and say, oh, see, if we were in our proper place on top, then, we would be ruling the world. That that way of thinking, okay, that relationship between heaven and earth, it's very karmic. That the situation of heaven is manifest on earth. It's the whole key behind astrology. But then you have the question, well, why is earth the way it is? What's the problem? And then one answer to the problem is, well, you're not doing it right. You're not living right, or you're not thinking right, or you're not talking right, or you're not building right, you're not acting right, you're not practicing right. And if you would practice right, then things would be aligned and you would be rewarded for your obedience and you would rise to the top. That's sort of the plan A. But then there's Job. And that plan is sort of cut down in Job. And then there's the destruction of the temple. And, well, what are you doing? Read the book of Ezekiel. And then there's Jesus, who is hung on a tree and loses. But then he rises again. And so you see the continual development of this. And so the book of Daniel is so key in this entire development. But, of course, you read the apocalyptic sections of the book of Daniel, and, you've got the heads and the horns and all of these things. And, Alexander the Great, there he is. And, well, makes perfect sense. Oh, good. I'm written into your text. And, if Cyrus got to be, the one chosen of the Lord, the anointed, the Messiah, well, why not Alexander? Well, it doesn't go quite as well with Alexander. Antiochus Epiphanes and Maccabees and all those things. But that was, of course, those darn generals on the backside of Alexander.
This is the tradition. And, of course, we know historically that Alexander, whenever he went to a city, he would always figure out, what does he need to do to join that city's pantheon? How does he become adopted as a son of the principality of that city? Right. And so I think, you can see that same pattern manifesting itself here. And in this case, it's not that Alexander can, sort of ritually become, the heir of David or something like that. But there's a joining at that point between what's happening in the Hellenic world, which is it's not a secular thing, right? Alexander's rise is not a secular thing, right? He's identifying himself as a divine figure, as actually multiple divine figures. The whole Alexander story is deeply religious, to the point that
deeply religious. Everything was religious. It's gods and men. It's two worlds mythology. It's, Alexander's not an idiot. No, he's a son of the gods. And, you can conquer the city, but that's costly. It's much better if you show up, intimidate them, and just say, I'm a god. It'll go great. Be part of my empire. Be part of my people. And don't you want to be a part of the winning team? Let's just open your gates, and we won't, we'll behave ourselves, and you can be part of us. And then we'll add your army to my army, and we'll keep going.
Even long into the Middle Ages, right? Alexander is sort of seen as this pre-Christian manifestation of the virtues, like sort of as like the highest human development, that the highest you could get without actually being a Christian. You've talked about the ascent of Alexander, and sort of he ascends and then sort of hits his limit. He can't go any higher than that, right? So.
And there are some traditions about Alexander which have him actually recognize the God of Israel and recognize the one God. So he's so impressed by the priests that come to greet him. He's so impressed by what he sees in terms of worship that he declares the unity of God. And this is important for people to understand, because that legend, that's why Alexander is in the Quran. Yeah. Like, Alexander is in the Quran because there was a tradition which was there within the Christian world, that Alexander had recognized the unity of God and therefore was acting like a predecessor to what Christianity would be, which is the pagans recognizing the God of the Hebrews as being this one God.
And
and there's something about that what's important is like there's something about that which is legendary, but there's something about the fact that Alexander was Aristotle's student, and there's a whole tradition of Alexander exchanging letters with Aristotle, and these are all apocryphal or whatever, but that the fact that he was Aristotle's student, that Aristotle had that notion of a single, that divinity was one, and that there was an unmovable mover, makes these legends that went around it not completely insane, not completely unfathomable,
right,
but rather talking in narrative form about a reality which is slowly developing in the West, which is this capacity to see the unity of the divine and to start to formulate it in a way that would ultimately culminate in Christianity. And so there is this sense in Justin Martyr and in some of the early fathers that this seed was there in the Greek philosophers, that there was a seed of what Christianity would bring was already there. So these legends of Alexander are talking about that in narrative form, and they end up creating something as powerful as having Alexander in a sacred text, in the Islamic sacred text.
So
now, to play the modernist, because I'm the Protestant after all, is it important that, put on my modernist hat, it didn't really happen? This is the question we have to wrestle through with these things, because and we're sort of in danger of having another two-level system. We have a two-world mythology and we have a two-level system, because maybe it happened in the heavenlies, maybe it happened in the storyverse, but this is a legend. It didn't really happen. But what's at play is this question really. And that's, that's the science, the Genesis science debate, the Bible and history debate. I mean, so many of these debates that we have been slogging through for the last few hundred years all revolve around this. And so a modernist will say, it didn't really happen, throw it away. But something did happen. And where is the location of that happening? And this is, I can't answer that here and now. This is what we as a group are processing to figure out what is real. And what is real is that which colonizes. What is real is that which wins. What is real is, but we're not at the end yet. And that's why eschatology is so important, because what's at the end, he who laughs last laughs best.
So another text tradition that is closely related to this is the Sibylline oracles, which I've been reading through recently. I'm about maybe halfway through, and those are.
Which we thank you for reading those, because they're really long and there's a lot of them.
They can be tedious sometimes, but there's some real nuggets in there. So just to say, usually we associate, maybe if you're a student of like mythology and folklore, you might associate the Sibyl with Rome, which is not incorrect, but actually in the ancient world, there were like a bunch of different Sibyls.
Maybe tell people what a Sibyl is, because a lot of people will not know what that is.
A Sibyl is it's a female oracle. Basically, it's a female prophet, a seer, somebody who's been given access by the divine to sort of know the future, to see the pattern manifesting itself in reality. And so actually your video on the apocalypse, the beast of the apocalypse, came at a really good time, because it came out just as I was getting into the Sibylline oracles. And something that's really key in there is, of course, scholars have gone through there and they said, well, this verse sounds like paganism, so this verse was written by a pagan, but then this verse is clearly supposed to mention, refers to Christ, and so this verse had to have been written by a Christian. And then they come across a verse that says, well, this verse references vaguely Judeo-Christian moral values, but it doesn't explicitly mention Christ, so that one must have been written by a Jew. And they dissect it like this, Man,
why I hate scholars so much.
I know. I apologize on behalf of my tribe. I really do. But I mean, like, it can be a little maddening
Yeah.
to kind of like try to trace that down. But if you just take all of that source criticism and you just set it to one side and you read the whole thing, it is actually, especially if you're familiar with any other.
And that move that he just made, I mean, that happened. I pull this book off the shelf every now and then. I should find the other one, really. That happened. When was Childs? It was mid 20th century. I mean, there's so much. Oh no, 1979. This book was. There was so much Bible as canon. So much of the commentaries were just unusable as a pastor. Evangelicals still had the Bible, but the main line. And so, Old Testament and biblical studies got to the point of, Brevard Childs and others just basically saying, oh, nuts to source criticism and form criticism and dissecting it and the documentary hypothesis, yada, yada, yada. It's run with that stuff if you want to, but it doesn't help people living through the beam within the Christian life navigate. And some of the dynamics around Pageau are exactly those dynamics that you can't, if you walk around like this, you're going to bump into stuff. You need both eyes. And
ancient medieval literature, deeply cohesive. And one of the things that's interesting in there, you said in your video on the Beast of Revelation that prophecies, the way prophecies work, they don't just refer to the one event at a certain point in time. Otherwise, once that event was passed, nobody would read them anymore, right? But rather, it's almost because there's this fractal structure to reality, that prophecies, you can see, they deal with the patterns, and even if the accidents change, the patterns manifest themselves over and over again. And you see that in the Sibylline oracles. So for instance, when they're dealing with judgment against a certain people, they'll pick two historical events that we would know, like, in a chronological sense, happened 500 years apart, but they both happen to the same Greek city, or they both happen to Rome, right? And so the Sibylline oracles, which, probably do come together as sort of, probably a hodgepodge of different sources, because, even if you believe what the ancients believed, there are many different Sibyls and they're writing at different times. And at some point, somebody could, collected these prophecies together. And of course, the first and the most important Sibyl, you'll like this, is Noah's daughter-in-law.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it all goes back to Noah.
Okay. Before we get too far with Noah, I mean, the point he made about prophecy, in an earlier video, I talked about the fact that as a pastor, I'll often have people ask me questions about, well, show me the prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament. And yeah, you can go to the suffering servant, and the easiest way is just pull up the Gospel of Matthew, or, pull up something out of the New Testament and say, oh, see, here it is because the New Testament says so. But often if you show those to people, they're just kind of like, that's a prophecy. And then you get into, let's say you're working through an Old Testament prophetic book, because just the way that word is used, people are expecting that, there's going to be a virus in a year of seeing, 2020, and the world will come to a halt, and spray tans will be forbidden, something like that. What he just said there about the pattern is really important, because when you would notice, one of the ones that I point out often in my videos is about the day of the Lord, and that comes in the book of Joel. And people look at it and say, are those grasshoppers? Are those Babylonians? Are they locusts? And just like he says, there's this pattern, and then they see these things with respect to these patterns. And they say, well, there's prophecy. And as I mentioned before, after Jesus' resurrection, he basically, because before the resurrection they weren't understanding anything he was saying, after he starts connecting the dots for them and said, this was about me, and this was about me, and this is about me. And we're like, well, what could he have been pointing to, because we're sort of missing it. And the New Testament doesn't, you're like, okay, Luke, you've used all this time to have all of these things, and now you're going to dump that on us? Well, the point is that everything before, and especially in the Gospel of Matthew, everything before was out of Egypt I will call my son. Oh, well, how does that drop the relationships in the Old Testament? And so then all of that goes. And, often, those of you who are really careful listeners would have heard me in a couple of videos talk about a pre-echo, which of course makes no sense. Well, what's a pre-echo? Because an echo has, if you go into a canyon out here in the beautiful American West, you clap your hands together and you just hear the clap echo. There's one primary noise, and then there's all these other echoes of the big noise. And I would often make the point sermonically, homiletically, that all of these days of the Lord are pre-echoes of the final day of the Lord. And they all bear in, but see, the reason I use a pre-echo is because the way an echo works in time is there's one big noise and then the reverberations, then the echoes. What if the big noise is at the end and we're actually hearing the pre-echoes? And we're experiencing the pre-echoes and all of these tiny little days of the Lord that happen in our lives. And they're usually calamity. They're eucatastrophes sometimes, or sometimes they're just calamities, or sometimes they're just windfalls, or, something like that. So this idea of pattern and prophecy, I found really, really helpful.
And in fact, it's either the first or the second Sibylline Oracle, there is this passage where it drops out of prophecy because it's describing the flood. It drops out of prophecy and it just starts describing, here's what happened in the flood. And it's this deep.
And now, again, a modernist would say, Noah's daughter. But you're not understanding what they're doing. We don't smirk at, sometimes we do, Star Wars fan fiction. Well, a lot of it's crap, I'm sure, but every now and then it's like, well, this is better than Star Wars. What do you mean better? What's doing the writing? Again, back to that other video. What's doing the writing? Yesterday's video is all about the precursor. There's these precursor texts, and then there's Kafka, the Borgesian. There's Kafka, and, well, you don't know that these other texts are precursors until you have Kafka, but you can read the precursors in Kafka, and so you begin to ask the question, am I writing the text, or is the text writing me? And again, historically, in terms of trying to organize the world by organizing physicality, let's say a mental GPS and a world clock, and trying to stipulate that, there's a way in which you're going to miss history. And my point about Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Well, did Caesar cross the Rubicon when he left Italy? Yeah, but you said, no, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Oh, but that event is the product of all of these meanings mapped. And so in a way, what we're having is, well, these meanings that aren't necessarily mapped physically. And that's why I say, if you look at, a lot of the gender drama going on now, it's actually not disconnected to any of this stuff.
Realistic firsthand account of Noah opening the door of the ark or the window of the ark and looking out on the sea and what he saw and how he felt and the color his face turned, and just the like all this stuff. Like it's this deeply, actually, I mean, it felt like something Tolkien could have written about the downfall of Numenor. In fact, some of the language was so close that made me like kind of raise an eyebrow. But then you get to the end of that oracle, and the prophetess reveals herself in a riddle, and if you work out the riddle, she's the daughter-in-law of Noah. So she was on the ark. So
and
again,
but
like you said,
you could, even the existence of these symbols and the existence of the kind of strange, what you could call mixture of the some more pagan symbols, some more Christian, some more Jewish, and how they're kind of brought together.
Right.
On the one hand, you could say that this is syncretic, and it is, but out of that syncretism can be pulled a notion that whoever it is that pulled these legends together thought that these could exist together,
Exactly.
like that they were living in the same world, that somehow the Hellenistic world and the Jewish world had a way to talk, had ways to talk to each other.
That's the thing. Whenever somebody starts to say such and such is syncretic, I'm always like, why is that an objection to you? Like, have you met people? Like, how else do we do things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's going to have to be syncretic in a faithful way. Well, how will you know if it's a faithful way?
It's also about meaning. It's like understanding that what makes syncretism problematic is when it goes against the truth, right? When it moves against the truth, but when sometimes it points towards the truth. And so that's why some of the ancient myths have a little seed of understanding what Christ will ultimately reveal. And in those seeds, we can see something valuable. And for example, like we all know that every single culture in the world has a flood narrative. So we could say something like, oh, those stupid cultures, they just copied the Jewish story and it's all.
Or the Jewish story copied
whatever. Don't look at that. It's horrible.
Right, that's right. Because the left says, oh, the Jews copied the flood story. And the right says, oh, those other cultures copied the Jews. And it's, okay, well, that criteria you're using to determine the value, you're bringing that to the fight. You're not getting that from them. Where is that value coming from?
Well, or like you said, or that it's just the Jews, or you could see, no, there's definitely a common experience on which this is based, whether it's a common experience in terms of history, or if it's an actual, almost like a genetic or like human nature thing that we have in us that bubbles up no matter what you.
Peterson, a human nature thing in us. Well, the evolutionary psychologist would hear that and think, I wonder if there is. Maybe I can describe it. Maybe there's circuits in the brain. Maybe there's, and this is sort of where Pageau and Peterson find their intersection.
You do that. It's almost like an imprinted memory on human nature. It doesn't matter how you look at it. That means that you can get nuggets from these other stories as well, and you can get a sense. Like when you read Gilgamesh, there are some things about the ancient flood that actually shine brighter when you read the Gilgamesh story, because you're like, oh, they're doing it this way.
And again, people. Preachers are just now Protestant preachers are just now getting to this, comparing, that these ancient texts in Genesis were comparing and contrasting with other texts and other cultures they were conversant with.
And so you say, oh, so it's pointing to something that I had noticed in the other texts.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to pause it here just because I'm out of time right now. I would love to sit here and go through the rest of it. Will I finish it? I don't know. But the whole video was spectacular. And I was really excited about this video after I listened to it. I'm easily excitable. My ADHD self. And, I'm right now sitting in a chair like a sane person. But when I hear a video that I really, really like, I jump up and down. And part of the reason I have this channel is part of the reason we started a meetup, and I have to get that meetup going again. And I'm thinking about, okay, what's the restart of this meetup version 2.0 look like? But I get excited about it. I jump up and down. I have no one to share it with, but I have you, and you have me. So here we are. Let me know what you think. Definitely, I don't know if you're a Pageau fan or not. Probably only. I'll of course put a thumbnail of this, and only Pageau fans will watch it. But let me know what you think in the comments.